This is long, and I'm not sorry. I've been asked to write about this, so here goes. Back in 1989, I was with my boyfriend Eddie, his best friend, my older sister Angie, and about 6 other people. We had spent the entire day mudding in the Royal Palm Mudflaps in Royal Palm Beach, Florida, also known as part of Palm Beach County. I grew up in West Palm Beach. I had never seen anything like this before or since. After mudding all day, we decided to call it a night and leave. Almost everyone was gone by then, so we all piled into Eddie's truck and left. Eddie saw a small mud hole and drove through it as one last hooray for the night. We got stuck. That small hole was deceptive. When I say we got stuck, I mean we were stuck for hours. I was pregnant with my first, so I was steering as the other 9 were pushing. That truck didn't budge. We had no choice but to wait until morning for someone to come pull us out, as we were now on our own. At about 5 a.m., we decided we should just relax and try to sleep until someone came through. Eddie, I, and his bestie were in the front. My sister and the other 6, who are all still friends with to this day, piled into the back and started to settle down. We were still making noise when I heard a sound. It was a rumbling growl. I knew immediately that it was some type of animal. I told everyone to hush and listen. Then we all heard it, and it was getting louder and more aggressive sounding. Eddie has a KC light behind his seat. He popped out, grabbed it, plugged it in, and lit the night up. That's when our world changed. 10 of us had our world rocked in a way we never expected. This thing ducked down and moved. Everyone was starting to freak out because it was clearly there, but what was it? Then it got pissed. This thing stood straight up, let out a roar that I can still hear 31 years later, leapt the large bush it was standing behind, and charged us. You could feel the earth literally shake with every running step it took. It was easily 8 to 9 feet tall. It was broad. It looked like an extremely large man with hair. Not fur, it had hair and lots of it. The KC light lit it up, and you could see the clumping of the hair. The smell was rotten and sour. Being pregnant, I was extremely sensitive to smells, and it was bad. We had spent hours, we're talking 5+ hours, trying to push this truck out. They say adrenaline gives you super strength. They're right. Eddie turned on his truck and started pushing on his door frame. His bestie leapt out his side and did the same. My sister and the other 6 let out screams as they piled out. And then all you heard was this thing running and roaring. Everyone else was dead silent as they put everything they had into pushing this truck out. With a sucking pop that I also can still hear, we were out and they were throwing themselves in the back as Eddie and his bestie jumped in and he floored it. This is woods with tight turns, and we flew around those turns. It felt like the devil himself was chasing us. After we got out and onto the main road, we headed for a gas station to calm down and call our families. When we got there, we all got out, sat with our backs to the wall, and that was it. We never said a word to each other, just silence. I think we were too raw, scared, and in complete shock over what happened. This was lore. This wasn't real. They don't exist. Yet there it was. After we all called our parents, we went home, one by one being dropped off. Not a word spoken. My sister and I did not discuss this until about 5 years ago. We finally opened up about that night and have slowly talked to the others. 25 years after the fact, and every single one of us that have spoken about it have the same exact story and memory forever burned into our minds. It wasn't cool. It was scary. I think the reason we couldn't talk about it for so long was because our brains were in denial at first, and then we didn't know how to open up about it. Now I can look back and say, holy crap, we saw freaking Bigfoot. I was out in the garden with a friend when my partner, Bob, called our dog Spot, just his name. Spot started running towards his name, then stopped dead in his tracks. In the same amount of time it took Spot to hear his name and run a few steps, I thought, Bob is calling Spot. I wonder why. Wait, was that Bob? The last thought coming just as Spot stopped with one front leg raised mid-step. My friend and I looked at each other, eyebrows raised. "Did you just hear that?" I asked. "Yes, it was Bob calling Spot," my friend replied, a bit dubious. You see, Bob was about 100 yards away last I knew, and his voice seemed to come from closer and to the right of where I thought he was. Feeling something was off, I yelled, "Bob, did you call Spot?" He responded, "What?" from where I had thought he was, and because he's a bit hard of hearing. Trying to be heard, I yelled, "Did you call Spot?" To which he replied, "Spot," thinking I was asking him to call the dog. Instantly, Spot takes off running to Bob. My friend and I look at each other with more eyebrow raising and agree that was weird. 10 minutes later, when Bob joined us in the garden, I asked him if he called Spot. He said, "Yeah, you told me to." I said, "Before that, before I yelled to you." He said no, and he thought it was weird that I was asking him to call Spot. I told him what happened, and he immediately guessed that it was a raven mimicking calling our dog. Then I was dubious, assuming a raven wouldn't sound exactly like him, or enough like him to fool myself, my friend, and Spot. Also, we've never heard the ravens talk before. Fast forward 3 weeks when I mentioned to my friend and a group of people how I've been creeped out at our place before, but that I can't stop thinking about that. He says, "Me too." Then, suddenly remembering, he turned to Bob and said, "Earlier today, when you walked up the hill, did you call for Nick?" referring to his partner who was also visiting. Bob said, "No, I don't think I've ever called for Nick." My friend then relates a similar story to the first one, hearing Bob call for Nick, but not from where he thought Bob should be. Feeling doubtful, then going to find Nick to see if he heard it too. He hadn't. This happened outside. We live in a fairly remote place in Northern California. National Forest borders 3 sides of our property, and we have neighbors to the north of us. None of the neighbors are close enough to hear, and they don't sound like Bob. I looked into corvids, as we have many, including ravens and stellar jays. The first one could be explained by this. Bob calls Spot often enough that it's not too far-fetched a corvid could be mimicking that. The second one is a bit harder for everyone involved to swallow. Bob hasn't said Nick's name very often on our property, mostly just in the last week that they have been visiting and certainly not calling it. I also looked into cryptids. I was told once that natives believed an entity lived on the mountain I now live on. I wasn't told much, just that it was neither good nor bad, but that the natives stayed well away from there. Any thoughts on what this could be? Please help. Weird sightings in St. Paul, Minneapolis. I don't know where else to post this. I believe in the paranormal and have had experiences myself. I'm posting this story from my girlfriend who doesn't have a Reddit account. Around half an hour ago at exactly 3:02 a.m., my girlfriend called me 2 blocks from her house, absolutely terrified. Her voice was shaking like I've never heard before. As she was driving towards her house, she saw a large white semi-humanoid figure crawling on all 4s, about 6 to 7 feet tall. It was stark white under a street lamp and its limbs were extremely skinny. She was so scared she couldn't get herself to leave the car to go into her house when she parked. I looked into local legends and old tales of just any creature I could find in the region. I came across the Wendigo. I sent her a screenshot of an image and the description I had found, and she said it fit to a T. Do you guys think this is possible? Have you seen anything like this? She isn't one for stories and would never lie to me, and both she and I are worried about what could happen to her after seeing such a weird thing. So, a little background, as it's been years since this encounter. I'm 28 male, now residing in Georgia, but at the time of the story I was about 13 in South Mississippi where this took place. Many years ago, my parents had gotten divorced. When my parents split, my dad moved in with my grandmother along with my younger brother in Mississippi. My mom had moved across state line to Alabama, no more than 40 miles apart. I decided to move in with my mom, but visited my dad every weekend because they agreed upon joint custody. Now, where my dad and my grandmother lived, that road had a lot of relatives of ours living down the street. From the beginning of the road to the end is honestly about 15 or 20 miles, but our relatives live starting with us at the beginning, and the last relative of our family lived about 2 miles deep of that same road. Pretty much the first 2 miles of this road. I knew it and had family on either side. So riding bikes or walking was very common for us kids at the time. Also, not much to worry about getting abducted due to my relatives. My last relative of this 2-mile stretch was by far my favorite to visit at this part of my life. My aunt and uncle lived there along with my cousin, whom was only 3 years older than me. My cousin and I were close. I mean, so close every time I'd visit my dad, I'd get there, visit for about 30 minutes, and then walk or ride my bike to my cousin's for the duration of that weekend. I adored him and my aunt and my uncle. We were big into Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, World Online, I mean, anything popping in the early 2000s, we had a slice of it. Sorry for the rambling, just painting the picture. So I get to my dad's Saturday morning, hang out for about 30 minutes and decide to ring up my cousin. Mind you, it's summer transitioning to autumn. Of course he's home. I get permission and start my trek alone. I can't remember why I didn't have my bike, but I remember it not being there. As I start walking, clouds get gray and it begins to drizzle. I'm not worried about it because I'm halfway there already and my clothes shouldn't get soaked due to this. As I pass a relative's home and before I get to my cousin's, there's this long curve that swings right. Once directly center of this curve, it's nothing but trees and dense brush on both sides with no houses in sight. Again, if center, to your left before the brush thickens, there's a small patch of grass about 3 to 4 feet high. I'm walking and get to this curve. As I get to the center of the curve, the rain gets a bit heavier. As the rain hits the pavement, I'm tightening my shirt collar around my neck to help keep dry. As I'm doing so, I start hearing rustling in the small patch of grass to my left. Thinking it could just be a deer, I turn left and see it. It was big, tall, humanoid-like creature. It had its back to me walking oddly slowly into the woods. It was about 7 foot tall and approximately 30 feet away from me. I fucking froze. I just stared at it. It was completely engulfed with hair, black hair, and down its back on the left and right side had a thin white vertical line running down both sides. Now, this is gonna sound stupid, but it looked like a 7 foot tall, standing on 2 legs, skunk with no tail. As soon as it got to the wood line, I booked it. I remember running on the center yellow lines of the road to help make my escape more quiet, and the rain helped with that as well. As I escaped the curve and it straightened out, I could see my cousin's place, and I didn't stop running until I reached the house. I tried to tell my cousin and my family about it, but everyone just wrote me off. I mean, I was only 13 and no proof. Phones nowadays didn't exist during this time, and if they did, we couldn't afford it. So no one believed me. I never walked down that road again. Now that I'm older and moved out of state, about twice a year I go down and visit some family around that very road, and every time I pass that curve, I look to see if I can't see it again. The Deor, also known as the not deer, is interesting because unlike Mothman or Bigfoot, or any of those, it doesn't have a solid description. It's basically anything you see that you first think is a deer, but then as you get closer or you observe it longer, you notice something that's off and go, that's not a deer. Sightings include Deor with backwards legs, odd neck joints, walking sideways with front-facing eyes, with backward heads, bipedal, etc., etc. It's generally spotted in the Appalachian Mountains and in several areas in the states around it. It's mostly a local cryptid, so unless you're either local or really into cryptology, or both, you probably won't find much about it or even know it exists. Last night, my aunt, I live with my aunt because of a complicated family situation, sent me outside because she was tired of listening to me pace around. I have ADHD and hate sitting still. Pacing helps me organize my thoughts, and was trying to sleep. So I went out. I called my partner and spent approximately 10 to 15 minutes sitting at a pond talking to them before I heard a laugh and got freaked out. I figured it might just be some people camping, but it was too close to me to have been someone there prior without me hearing. and we live on a Civil War battleground, so I wasn't about to take my chances with a ghost. I walked back to my house and sat on the porch, still in call with my partner. This is all unrelated to the Deor, just explaining why I was on the porch. We were mostly sitting in silence until I saw a deer in the bushes next to my house. It was kind of far off, maybe 20-ish feet, and most of it was behind a tree next to a bush, so all I saw was from the shoulders up. It was staring at me, which I didn't think much of because, hey, it's wildlife and sometimes they stare at people. I noticed the shape of its face was off, but figured I just wasn't used to seeing deer from the front, as I usually only see them from the side. The deer eventually turned its head, and I saw that the reason it looked so weird was because it had a dog's jaw. It looked like those pictures of horses photoshopped to have a dog's mouth, but with a deer head instead. It started moving towards me, and the bushes rustled really loudly from it. I didn't pay much attention to how it moved because, obviously, I was just focused on getting inside, so I can't confirm if it had backward joints or was walking sideways or any of that. I had to hang up the phone once I got inside because I wasn't supposed to be in calls when everyone else was asleep. But over text, my partner confirmed they heard the bushes and what sounded like galloping before I closed the door. I don't know if anyone else has seen a Deor with a jaw like that, but I have seen some described as the predator version of a deer, which may include the jaw. If anyone else on here has Deor sightings, feel free to tell their story. I must have been 14 at the time, and I'd just moved into my dad's apartment. I had been living with my mom, but there was some issues about the place we lived, so I was with my dad until we could find a new place. My dad just so happened to live in a block of flats roughly 20 feet from the gates of the biggest graveyard in town. He often joked about if he died, they wouldn't have to take him far, just throw him out the window. My things were still in boxes. My desk was an old kitchen table. I was using a box underneath my computer mouse. My computer chair was a bar stool with a reflective bottom, and everything was basically makeshift at that point. I remember deciding to go to sleep early. All the lights were off, and I could hear my dad puttering about in the living room and kitchen, going back and forth, probably cooking some late-night meal. That's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I thought it was a spider on the reflective stool, but then I took a closer look and realized that it had 4 legs rather than 8. It took a few moments to realize that it was in fact not shaped like a spider, but rather a tall, thin man, completely black and naked, and that it wasn't on the stool, but instead the stool was reflecting what was crawling from behind my wardrobe. I instinctively held my breath and remained still, just watching this thing in the reflection. At first, I thought it was maybe someone who had sneaked in and I was about to be murdered, but then the thing started crawling up the wall, diagonally. I got a better look at it, and it didn't appear to have any eyes, just these hollow parts in its head. The skin looked leathery and burned, almost petrified, like one of those mummies or bog bodies. It had these ridges along its back, unnaturally long arms and legs, and every movement it made gave off a small clicking sound like when you fail to open a bottle of medicine. I closed my eyes a few times, telling myself I must be dreaming, but every time I opened them, it had moved slightly somewhere else, crawling up to a window above my bedroom door. I could hear my dad walking from the living room to the kitchen again, probably to retrieve his meal from the oven, and the thing's head seemed to watch my dad and follow his movements. I let out a small terrified sound, crying in fear at this point, and the thing seemed to snap its neck around in my direction. At that point, things go blurry. I think I passed out from fright, but the moment I woke up, I searched my room. There wasn't enough of a gap between the wardrobe and the wall to fit a person. A suggestion someone gave me to try to figure out what this thing was that perhaps someone wasn't in the bedroom, but rather outside my window casting a shadow onto the wall. But I outright refused this idea. I was on the 9th floor, and the thing I saw was very much a solid object, not a shadow. I have no idea what I saw, and I have seen nothing like it since that night. I have tried to figure out what this thing was for a long time now, but I've only been able to figure out what it was not. It was not a dream. I was not asleep when I saw it. It was not a 4-legged spider. The reflection showed it behind objects the stool was reflecting. It wasn't a shadow. Shadows aren't that solid. Whatever it was probably the most terrifying thing I have ever seen, and those small clicking sounds will haunt my memory forever. I want to begin by saying I've never really known where to speak about this, but since I found the subreddit, it seems like this is the most appropriate place to share this encounter. I've told my parents about it, and they obviously just said it was my imagination. I told my cousins at the time, and they said that it was a ghost, but I doubt a ghost would be this flamboyant. I have no idea what it was. This goes back about a decade. I was around the age of 11, currently a 22 male, and my family was visiting Mexico for the summer as we usually did. Our house over there is fairly big and has a courtyard where we grew some trees and flowers. Naturally, you can look up at the sky from the courtyard. Well, it was late at night and we were all getting ready to go to bed. My mom had bought some pan dulce, sweetbread, and my sister made a half-ass attempt to call me to the kitchen while I was in the TV room. At this point, everyone that wasn't already in bed was in the kitchen eating a late snack. I walked out of the room and into the courtyard, which was faster than walking through the rooms. When crossing through the courtyard, I noticed a glow coming from above me. I looked up and I saw a humanoid figure that was made out of pure orange, almost goldish light. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought maybe it's a weird balloon or something, but it was very clear that it was peeking over the edge of the rooftop. I thought maybe it was a weird balloon or something, but it was very clear that it was peeking over the edge of the rooftops as it had hands on the edges of the roof. Its head wasn't perfectly round though, it had a weird flat top thing going on. Picture, if you will, a goldfish snack, if you held it from its head with its tail on top, but less exaggerated. It had very tiny beady eyes. Literally, its eyes were the only feature it had, apart from the weird flat top. No mouth, no ears, no nose. I gazed at it for less than 10 seconds or so, and before it departed, it waved weakly. I could hardly call it a wave, but that's what it resembled. It just raised its left hand and waved it very slowly, and then it left my line of sight. I ran towards the kitchen after that, since I was spooked. I didn't even tell my mom at that moment. I waited for the next day to tell her and my dad. I remember having some trouble sleeping that night. I even moved to a room with more family in it. Growing up, this became one of my most vivid memories. It has also led me to dive deeper into cryptids and strange phenomena in general. That moment was honestly one of the strangest experiences I've ever had in my life, and nothing has been able to come close. I don't tell many people this because it's outlandish and stories like this aren't widely accepted. It's seen as just crazy talk or kids' imagination gone wild. As far as I know, there's no Mexican folklore about a glowing humanoid figure, and I've never heard of a similar encounter, so to this day I have no idea what it was that I witnessed. Just the other day, my eldest kid, who's 17, was out walking the dog late with her younger sister. This was after midnight. We live in a very small town in Ireland. The kids take the dogs down the alley behind our house to a car park for a runaround. It's attached to some unused land. The entrance to the car park allows a line of sight back onto the streets and a bridge that crosses over the river. It's well lit with streetlights, so you can clearly see when people are walking across. This particular night, those kids were back from the walk quick as a flash. My eldest was freaked. She had seen a glowing red figure with no features walking across the bridge. She moved out of the car park to get a better look, only for it to have disappeared. My youngest didn't see the figure, merely a flash of something glowing red. Since then, my eldest has been trying to convince herself of the possibility that it was a person in a red hooded sweatshirt, but it's not working. She knows what she saw. This is a strange little town, something we didn't know when we moved here, but really glad we did. The strangeness just keeps coming.